For my book presentation for grief counseling, I chose to read Charlie St. Cloud. So this story centers around two brothers, and there's an older brother who's named Charlie and a younger brother who is named Sam. The St. Cloud comes from the place that they live in. And so the older brother, Charlie, he is currently graduating from high school and he's accepted a scholarship to a university. And he has to move away from that university, and he got the scholarship for sailing. And his younger brother, Sam, is still in middle school. And one night, Charlie goes out to hang out with his friends or to go watch a game, and whenever he leaves, he notices that his little brother had hidden in the back seat because he wanted to go to his friend's house. And that's fine, Charlie doesn't care to take him there, but while they're driving, a semi-truck runs a red light and hits them in the side, and this causes Sam to pass away. Due to the sudden loss of his brother, Charlie faced a lot of difficulty in regards to how he grieved. Instead of going away to college for the sailing scholarship, he decided to stay in his hometown and actually take up a job as a groundskeeper at the graveyard where his brother is buried. And with this job, he actually had a residence on the graveyard property as well. Eventually, he starts to see Sam's spirit, and he decides to set up a time every evening after the cannon goes off to meet up with his little brother and to play baseball, because before the accident, Charlie was supposed to spend the summer before college teaching him how to play ball, so whenever Sam reappears to him, that's the thing that he wants to do together. Finally, Charlie's friends get him to get out of the house, and whenever he does, they go out to a bar together, and he meets a girl named Tess. Now, Tess is a sailor as well, and she was actually preparing to take a trip to sail around the world. So Charlie continues seeing Tess until one day he learns that the boat that she had went out on a practice sail never returned. So in that moment he realizes that, like with his brother Sam, he had actually been seeing the spirit of Tess, but he doesn't think that she's dead. He is convinced in his heart that she is still alive, so he sets out to save her. And whenever he goes out on the ocean to save her, it's going to take some time, and as he is sailing, the cannons go off, and he realizes that he's not going to be able to meet Sam for the first time in weeks since they've been meeting every single time. But he does that, and he says goodbye to Sam in that moment, and he goes on, and he actually does find Tess, and she is alive, and he gets there in time to warm her up, and help arrives, and he ultimately saves her life. And at this point in the book, Charlie had overcome his grief for Sam and learned how to move on. Characters in the book grieved Sam's death appropriately. They took the time that they needed to come to terms with his death and to find a little bit of meaning in it and to go on about their lives without him in their world. But Charlie did not grieve appropriately. His grief actually impacted his daily functioning. He was unable to move past the loss of his brother, which leads readers to believe that that's why he moved to the graveyard, so he could be close to him in a way. And Charlie's grieving process, although it was already a little rocky to begin with, it was completely interrupted whenever he began to see his little brother's spirit. And then I noted here that from a scientific standpoint, you may even consider that he wasn't actually seeing his little brother's spirit, that it was his own grief projecting this scenario up, because he was supposed to be teaching his little brother baseball the summer before he went to college. He was feeling guilty about going to college, and then he probably, well, actually, I know he does. He feels guilty about the accident because he was the one who was driving when his brother died, and now he is seeing his spirit, and he's trying to teach him baseball like he was supposed to. So it does kind of cause readers to believe that maybe this is his own grief projecting this. And as we have learned in class, an important task for mourning is to help the client adjust to the world without the deceased. Charlie had been struggling with it, but completely stopped imagining his world without his little brother whenever he began to see his spirit again. So as we've learned in class, there are many reasons why a person may experience complicated grief. And one of the reasons why they may experience complicated grief is because of the kinship. And that's just their relationship with the person. And as you read throughout the book, not only is Sam Charlie's little brother who he loves, but Sam is also like one of the closest people in his life, and Charlie loves him a lot. So because they were so close, that leads me to believe that was one of the reasons why he had such a difficult time moving on and to start adjusting to a world where Sam wasn't in it anymore. I also think that Charlie had difficulty grieving because Sam's death was so sudden and tragic. No one expected that to happen. You can't plan for a situation like that to occur. And I think that suddenness of it, and even the fact that Charlie was the one behind the wheel, I think that impacted his grieving process. So we've talked about it in class, and whenever counselors are examining if a person is grieving normally or if it's complicated grief, we kind of look at how it is interfering, or if it is interfering with their daily functioning. And just by examining Charlie's behavior throughout the entire book, you can definitely see that it does impact his daily functioning. I noted here he does not socialize well or often. The part where his friends finally got him to come out is difficult to get him there, and even whenever he was there, it was kind of like he didn't know how to talk to people anymore, and he even almost got into a fight with a person, so that was a little bit rocky for him. And another reason why I believe that it impacted his daily functioning was because of the fact that he did reject his scholarship to a university and chose to stay in his hometown and work at the graveyard where his little brother is buried. And so that really impacted his occupational life, his social life, and just the general process of moving on. So Charlie began to cope with his grief over Sam after he met Tess. And Tess is the girl who he ended up saving her life later. She provided an outlet and a form of socialization that he had not been receiving before, because before that he didn't really talk to anyone. He just spent all of his time at the graveyard. But after he met Tess, they started hanging out more, and she was coming by to see him, and he was going to see her. So she provided a really good outlet and a way for him to finally start reconnecting with the world around him again. We've talked about it, and perceived social support is important in determining if a person will face complicated grief or not. And most of Charlie's friends had gone away, or they were gone away to like college or to get a job in another place, or they were getting married, and some had even passed away. So he really didn't feel like he had much social support. And I think that Tess provided him with the social support that he did need to start to cope with Sam's death and to grieve appropriately. So we've talked this semester about tangible and symbolic grief, and I think that you can see both of those things throughout the course of this book. The tangible grief that Charlie encountered was the loss of his little brother, and the symbolic grief that he experienced included losing his hopes of attending college, since he decided to reject his scholarship, losing his dream of sailing. As I mentioned before, his scholarship was for sailing, and he used to, before his little brother died, they would sail in competitions together. It was a really big part of his life, so he lost that. And also, he kind of lost a part of himself because he was really connected to his brother, and a large part of his identity came through sailing and doing well because he would win, and it was great, and that was really a big part of who he was. So whenever he gave up on that dream after Sam's death, it was kind of like he lost a part of who he was. So I said here that I thought that for Charlie to begin to grieve properly, he needed some form of closure. So like I mentioned before, he was supposed to teach his little brother baseball that summer, and then whenever he starts to see his spirit again, that's what he's doing, is teaching him baseball, and in some way that's kind of closure to cope. And since Sam's death was sudden, he didn't have time to say goodbye, and he felt guilty because he had been the driver in that accident. And I think that played a big part in his grief too, and I think he needed time to be with his brother and to apologize for the accident, which he did, and to hear that Sam didn't hold him guilty for it, and just have that time to say goodbye. Whenever he was sailing out to save Tess, he didn't say goodbye to Sam face to face because he obviously couldn't meet him, but there's a moment where he says goodbye to him in his heart, and I think that was a really big moment for him to start grieving appropriately and to find that closure and cope. So I personally think that this book is a really good example of grief. And I mean, the title of the book I wrote here is actually called The Death and Life of Charlie St. Cloud, which is really interesting. But it is a very good example of grief, because not only does it show how grief affects you normally, but also it takes it to some very extensive measures. Because, like I mentioned, I personally don't think that he was actually seeing his little brother's spirit or ghost or whatever. I think that it was just projected. I think he was having a really difficult time grieving, and that just caused him to start to see his brother and to fulfill that promise that he had made to him and to find that closure. It shows a clear example of complicated grief and also offers an easy examination of the tasks of mourning that had not been achieved. And if you didn't know about the tasks of mourning, I can see why, that might be a little bit difficult. Obviously, you would know that he's not grieving well, but after reviewing those tasks throughout the class, whenever I read this book, I was able to apply that specifically. And also, this book provides the opportunity to teach how Charlie finally began to cope with the loss of his brother. So it didn't just end on a negative note, and it kind of showed the way that through social support, through trying to adjust to the world without the deceased, you can start to grieve, and you can get through that, and you can find a way to cope and get the closure that you need and find meaning in your life again. So what I learned, this book allowed me to take a deeper look at the tasks of mourning and complicated grief. I mean, we've talked about it, we've read about it and watched videos, but it is a lot different whenever you're reading a fictional story and you can actually apply these very specific topics that are factual and studied, and you can apply that to a fictional text about a character who, has this very complicated story going on. So I kind of learned the tasks of mourning and understood complicated grief a little bit better just by seeing it from like a character perspective. It also allowed me the opportunity to learn about how complicated grief can interrupt a person's daily functioning. Obviously, this scenario is a bit more extreme than it may be in some cases, but it really is important to keep in mind that grief can be very overwhelming, and you might not even notice it. Like in the book, Charlie doesn't even honestly realize or have that knowledge that he has completely interrupted his entire life over this. So it's really important to keep that in mind, and I definitely learned that throughout reading this book. For future application, I would apply this to my future work just by understanding that kinship and the reasoning behind the death are very impactful to the grieving process. Even kinship to me even is not just mom, dad, brother, because you could not be close to your dad but super close to your uncle, so that would be completely different. I think it really also depends on just the connection that you have with the person, because if Charlie hadn't been so close to his little brother, if they weren't really connected at heart very well, then it may have been easier to grieve. Obviously, grieving is never easy, but it might have been a little bit less challenging for him. And then the reason behind the death, if it's sudden or if it's planned, obviously, grief is always really challenging, but if you have a little bit of preparation before it, it can be helpful. And Sam's death was really sudden in this book. No one saw it coming, so it really allowed me to see how that changes the process. Also, I would apply it because I understand how complicated grief can seriously impact an individual's daily functioning. And I already touched on that a little bit, but I think that's just really helpful for future work if I encounter a situation with grief counseling, so that I can keep that in mind, that even if I've not had that specific issue, I know that it can impact their daily life, and I understand the extent to what it can impact them. And then lastly, I said how important it is for those experiencing complicated grief to socialize. This was a big aspect of the book, and honestly, I read this in high school, and that time I did not get this at all. Like, I did not consider that his lack of socialization was part of the reason why he wasn't handling the grief very well. But throughout the course, learning about that and that being one of the key ways to determine complicated grief or normal grief, that just really allowed me to learn more. And now I know in future work that socialization and perceived peer support is really crucial whenever you are working with someone who is going through grief. And that's all.